Hey, what's going on, guys? Welcome back. Kellen here with Droid Life. And no, your eyes do not deceive you. This is indeed an iPhone 6 in my hand. Space gray, black front, all that good stuff. So, why do we have this? Well, a couple of reasons. Over the last couple of years, Apple's really updated iOS and basically added in a bunch of Android functionality or reinvented it or whatever you want to call there. So as that's happened, we've gotten more and more interested in the competition. And then this year they released two new phones. So the iPhone 6 and the 6 Plus, which both have larger displays. So sort of Apple admitting that all these Android manufacturers were right all along and people do like big phones. And so we thought now there couldn't be a better time than to look at these phones and sort of give a serious review or some serious impressions, and again, really get to know the competition a little bit better. So that's why we have one. Let's talk a little bit about specs. Actually, let's do a test here. So if I cover this phone up, and let's say you didn't know what this phone was, and I said I've got a phone in my hand with a 4.7 inch, barely better than 720p display with 1 gig of RAM, and around an 1800 milliamp hour or so battery, 8 megapixel camera, 1.2 megapixel front camera, dual core processor. What would you say? You probably wouldn't want anything to do with it, right? You would say this is a mid to low range Android phone, and you probably wouldn't even think about considering it. And it's essentially what the specs are of the iPhone 6, right? We've got, dual core processor, gig of RAM, all that stuff. Now, to be fair, the processor is 64-bit, and the performance is insanely good, and benchmarks have already shown that it's a topper. But you've got the 8 megapixel camera, the 1.2 megapixel front camera, and you've kind of got what we would consider to be, a mid-range spec phone. For example, the Galaxy Alpha is Samsung's new metal phone, and it's coming to AT&T soon, and it's priced at $199, and it's got basically the same specs, but most people thought that it was overpriced at $199. But no one's ever said that about the iPhone at $199. So just kind of an interesting, just put things into perspective a little bit there. Let's talk about some things, though, that we like about the new iPhone. We'll start there. Camera, obviously, right? So the iPhone cameras have been good for a really long time, and there's nothing has changed there. Basically, you fire up the camera, start snapping pictures, and they all seem to sort of turn out really good. In low light, it's amazing and fast. In regular light, it's really, really impressive. I would say that this camera is probably one of the most impressive I've used on any smart device ever. So that's not surprising, but I'm just saying I wish some of the Android OEMs would get it together and sort of create camera experiences like this. Now, you've got slow-mo video at 240 frames per second, time lapse. A lot of these modes and stuff aren't necessarily new, like the square mode for Instagram. But again, the deal here is that the camera just really is that good. And I wish again, that OEMs from Android would do something very similar. And so far, they haven't been able to do that. In terms of performance, the phone just flies around. Apple definitely works some mojo. When you're double tapping to open new apps and switching between them and jumping in from one app to the next and back home and all that stuff. Everything just happens really, really fast, and it's really smooth. And, this is iOS 8 in its first basically public build, and it still seems to not really have many problems. It's pretty impressive. Also, you guys probably noticed this, but when I unlock the device, Touch ID, actually really cool. So Samsung has a fingerprint scanner. It's nothing like the one that Apple uses. So basically you have it locked, and I've got both thumbs trained in here, and you touch it for about a half second and unlocks your device, and you can use it to pay for things. And again, Samsung has that swiping version in the Galaxy S5 and a couple other phones now, and it's absolutely terrible. This thing, you really just kind of put your finger on there for about a half second, it unlocks, and you can use it to verify to pay for apps and other things, and people are actually building in functionality with it, unlike Samsung's. It's just a really, really nice job. So Apple, you definitely deserve props for getting your fingerprint sort of thing right. Let's talk about the display. Display, even though it's just barely over 720p, is actually really, really good. You can see here, well, it's sort of tough to tell on camera, but it feels like it's floating as close to the top of the glass as you can possibly get. Which means like viewing angles are great. And when you touch things, you actually kind of feel like you're touching them a little bit. Now, they've also done this sort of rounded edge, which we saw on the Nexus 4. And we're also seeing now on the new Moto X, which I really love. So when you're touching the display and swiping around, it's always sort of rounded and smooth. There's no sharp edges whatsoever. And then, of course, Apple and their touch sensitivity is second to none. So when you're moving your finger, when you're touching the display and swiping, it basically follows your finger as it should. And, Android devices have always had a little bit of lag there, which can't really explain, and they've always been trying to catch up on. So some other things, I do like battery usage. You can see here I've got over 8 hours of standby and almost 4 of usage time. And I don't know how that relates to Android's battery usage meter, but basically like last night I unplugged my phone at 8 a.m. and last night went to bed and I still had 30% at midnight or something. So even with that 1800 milliamp hour battery, this thing seems to last all day. Whereas, devices like the Moto X with a 2300 milliamp hour battery can't seem to do. So kind of unfortunate. Those are things I like. Let's talk about some things I don't like. Number one would be the design of this phone. So Apple is known for making sort of skinny yet tall and slim phones. So that's why you kind of get that weird resolution on the display. They really are kind of like a candy bar. And so when you're holding it in hand, it just feels tiny and thin and almost too light, if that's something to be worried about. This phone just, to me in general, feels kind of like a toy. And I'm not trying to just be overly critical, but it's just so light that you don't like. So like here's the One M8. You hold this in your hand, it feels like you're holding a phone in your hand. You hold the iPhone 6, it feels like you're holding an iPod Touch or a toy. It doesn't really have that substantial weight that lets you know, again, this is a really expensive piece of technology. And that could just be my being picky, but overall I'm not exactly a fan. Overall of the design, just in general, I'm definitely not a fan of. So when this thing was leaking months ago, you get this sort of dual panel look with the camera protruding, and now, before you jump on me and say, oh, you just hate all Apple products, I actually like the design of the iPhone 5 and 5S. I thought it was brilliant with its sort of sharp edges and sort of that industrial yet modern design. It was a beautiful phone. This thing is just rounded and it's almost retro-y, and it's got these lines and these 2 panels, and this is the space gray, and I would say it's probably the best looking of them all. Do not buy the gold one. You will regret it. Also got these, big chin and foreheads that are matching, and it looks like an iPhone still. It's just not exactly my favorite design of a phone ever. The new Moto X feels incredible in hand with its leather and all that stuff. So, but again, personal preference. I know a lot of people really like the iPhone. So, in terms of buttons, volume, and the sort of lock switch up here, I get mixed up a lot, so not really a fan of that either. So there are definitely some questionable design choices, I think, with the iPhone. Obviously, 10 million or so people that bought it this last weekend will disagree with me, but it is what it is. So let's talk about some other things. With iOS, you don't have, or any Apple product, you don't have a back button, right? You just have the single home button, and we're so used to the back button on Android. So if you're in an app, you go into another app, you can hit the back button and jump back to it. So Apple's built in this thing where you can sort of, if you go somewhere, you can just quickly swipe from the left edge and it'll take you back. And it works pretty well for the most part, except when you're in another app and you want to go back to another app. There's no way to do that. So you have to do the double tap to open multitasking and then jump in and try to find the app you were just in. And they do an okay job. It just doesn't seem to be as efficient as a back button. And again, that's just because I've used Android so often, but I've really found to appreciate the back button. Let's talk sound for a second. So sound on iPhones is really weird, or someone needs to teach me better how to use this. But you can see when I controlled the volume there, I turned my ringer up and down. But like if I were to get a notification from Hangouts, it would not be at that volume. It would be at some crazy loud volume. And I've tried time and time again to figure out how to adjust individual volumes on individual notifications, and it just seems so hit or miss, or Apple doesn't know. And you can kind of see here in the notification settings, every single app is listed here, and so you have to control individual app settings and decide if you want banners and pop-ups and alerts, and if they're in notification center or on the lock screen, and if you want to allow them at all. And each individual app, you could seriously go in and customize this, and it's completely overwhelming. But yet you can't customize individual sounds, I don't believe, unless you're in that app and it's notifying you. It's super confusing. You can see right here is one slider for ringer and alerts. There should be like 4. So it's kind of ridiculous. And now these are problems with iOS just in general, not necessarily this phone. It's probably like this on all Apple products. So anyways, notification sounds a little overwhelming. And then that takes us sort of into settings, which are already in here. And you can see there's a lot. I mean, when you talk about Android or Samsung phones having settings, look at an Apple product. So again, notifications, you have a separate listing for each app. But if you scroll down just in general settings, there's also another separate listing for each app. Nothing's combined. Everything's separated into these silos. It's really the weirdest thing. Like here's a bunch of Apple apps together, and then here's some social ones together, and then here's just everything else at the bottom. It just kind of goes all over, and it's really sort of confusing. I'm not going to lie. And then here's back to notifications a little bit. Notification center, you can see in here, and I'm picking on mailbox because it's here, but a lot of these emails in here I got rid of a long time ago from my computer, and they either don't sync with iOS, or maybe the mailbox app needs to update. But there's a bunch of things like that continue to sort of drive me nuts. So anyways, these are iOS things, and those things can change, or I can get used to them. The hardware is another thing. But again, we're going to do a full review and sort of dive into all of this and just kind of let you guys know what's going on here. And so, I get why people so far like this phone. It's simple, performs well. The battery life's nice, and the camera's amazing. And those are sort of things that Android manufacturers seem to miss at least one or two of all the time, and Apple's kind of nailed those. It just comes down to OS preferences, I kind of feel at this point. So anyways, we'll have a lot more thoughts. We're going to try not to overwhelm you, though. We know you want Android news, not iOS news, but we thought this was probably worth doing. So as we prepare for all of that, let us know if you guys have any comments or questions. In the meantime, we're Droid Life, and this is the iPhone 6. Kind of weird. Peace.